Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that the right book at the right time can change lives, and that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do here on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature: picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels for readers of all ages. In each episode, we'll talk with children's literature authors and discuss their books, their hopes, their dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. Whether you're an adult reading to their inner child or connecting the young readers in your life with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. So grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie Affinito, your KidLit Loving host, inviting you back to another bookish conversation with a children's literature author. Today, I'm talking with Megan E. Freeman. Megan is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel in verse, Alone. This book tells the story of a young girl who wakes up one day to find herself utterly alone in her small Colorado town. Megan's here today to talk about her newest release, Away. This companion book to Alone follows a group of children after a sudden evacuation from their homes as they come together at a relocation camp to investigate the threat that put them there. I devoured both of these books, literally devoured them. And quite honestly, I wished there were many more already that I could go to. I'm thrilled to get the chance to talk with Megan today about them, so we are going to do just that. Megan, welcome to KidLit Love. I am thrilled you're here today.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. I am actually going to use a word I don't think I've used on the podcast to describe how I devoured your books. I think the closest way I can describe it is that I was literally suction cupped to your pages.
Oh my gosh, what a great image.
Yeah, I could not put them down. I could not stop turning the pages and just leaning in to both of the stories. And that really is the best adjective I think I can, or maybe adverb. I don't know. It's the best word that I think I can come up with. And listeners, I hope it conveys how just enthralling these books are. So I can't wait from a reader to an author to have our conversation today. So thank you. Thank you
Oh,
so
thank you.
much.
That's amazing. It's really great to hear. Of course, that's got to be every author's goal, right? Is to be able to make that kind of a connection with a reader.
Yeah. So why don't we start with you? I know that I introduced two of your books, but that is not the only story of your writing career. So I'd love for you to give us a bit about you and your writing and your journey to children's literature.
Sure. So my journey to children's literature started in my own childhood, honestly. I went to an extraordinary elementary school in Northeast Los Angeles in the 1970s, and we had a program where poets came into our classroom every single week and did poetry with us, and they would give us prompts and we would write to those prompts and then we would read what we'd written. They'd talk about it. We'd do revision. I mean, we did all kinds of stuff. It was very engaging and interactive. And they came in every single week for 3 years.
Wow.
So fifth grade, sixth grade, and seventh grade, we were working with these poets. And at the end, and it's so, it's funny. I am still connected to one of my teachers from that school, and I need to reach out to her and ask her more about how that program was actually
Yeah.
managed and if it was a grant or, now that I've been a teacher for so many years, I'm really curious about how they made that happen. But at the end of each year, they published an anthology and they would select poems from kids at all the schools that they worked with. I think they worked with 4 or 5 different schools in the district. And so we would hold these books in our hands that had our poems in them and the poems of our friends and the poems of neighboring kids. And it was an extraordinary experience. And I fell in love with poetry and I fell in love with writing poetry. So I have been writing poetry since I was 10 years old. And there have been times when I've done more or less. Um, but I from that time I always wanted to be a writer. I grew up, I fell in love with other things. I went to school to study theater. I worked in theater for a while. I fell in love with teaching. I started teaching. I eventually became certified as an English language arts teacher. And so then I was teaching kids and we were writing together. I always shared my poems with my students and let them know that I was also a practicing writer and maybe just a little bit further down the spectrum of mastery than they were, but that it was a lifelong endeavor for me. Um, and it was great because in the beginning, when I was first learning how to submit poems for submission, like in journals and magazines and anthologies and things like that, I wasn't writing for children at all. I was just writing for myself.
Mhm.
And if I got a poem accepted, I could go to school and say, "Hey, you guys, I got a poem accepted." And then kids would be like, "Oh, how does that work?" And then they would submit their stuff. And we really created what I like to think of as a culture of writing and sharing, which was really rich and rewarding, at least for me, hopefully for them as well. But I always wanted to write a novel. That was always something that I aspired to do. And so I wrote one that's in a trunk that nobody will ever see, that I don't even know who it was for. Maybe new adult, maybe adult. I don't even know. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just writing down story ideas. Um, but but then fast forward to my daughter being in middle school, we were in a book club together and we read Island of the Blue Dolphins, which I fully acknowledge is a problematic text in the 21st century when we're looking back and we're assessing different values in different times. But what I learned when we read that book together was that it was based on a true story, which I had not known when I read it myself when I was a kid. And it's the story of this woman who lived on an island off the coast of Southern California for 18 years. And the kids in this book club, here we are in landlocked Colorado, the kids in this book club were really fascinated by the idea of surviving on an island and where would you get fresh water and how would you know where food was. And it occurred to me in that discussion that blue dolphins, the story of blue dolphins and the experience of the woman living there was not the same as your typical survival story, like Hatchet, which we had also read, right? Hatchet, Brian falls into the forest and is totally lost and completely at his wit's end and trying to figure out how he's going to survive. But the woman who lived on that island in California, she wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was. She was home. She was just alone, and her challenges to survive were about being alone more than being lost. And I said to the kids in the club, "What if you came home tomorrow and everybody in your town was gone? You know, you came home from school, your entire house or wherever you sleep, everybody's gone. The neighborhood is empty. You go looking for people, there's nobody there. How would you survive? What would you do?" And that was the seed that became the book Alone that you talked about. Um, I couldn't get that question out of my head of in a contemporary suburban setting, how might a kid survive alone?
Mhm. So that was the impetus for moving into the first novel, which didn't always start as prose, right? It started, or I'm sorry, didn't always start in verse. It started as a speculative
Exactly.
prose. So tell us about
Exactly. Yeah. So, right. So I sat down. So this question of how might a kid survive alone haunted me for months before I started writing. And I would literally, I'd be driving down the street and think, okay, if I was 12 and everybody was gone and I was alone, how would that feel? And what would I do? Would I walk down the middle of the street or would I walk on the sidewalk? You know, all those kinds of like,
Yeah.
what are the rules when nobody's here? And one day I finally sat down to start to write. And for whatever reason, I just started writing in sentences and paragraphs and chapters. And maybe it was because we were reading prose novels in our book club. Maybe I don't know. I was familiar with verse novels, but it didn't occur to me to write one. And so I actually worked on alone in different draft forms in prose for 4 or 5 years. And I joined the Society for Children's Writers and Book, or SCBWI, Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. I started going to conferences. I had critiques with agents and editors and different critique partners. And I did a number of revisions. I worked on it for a long time. And I finally decided to go out on sub with it to try to get an agent. And I got a lot of interest because I think because it had this hook of a contemporary reimagining of Blue Dolphins, which people who remembered that book were like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. So I got a lot of requests for full manuscripts, but nobody wanted to buy it. And then I was sitting in a workshop, an SCBWI workshop, with the author Melanie Crowder, who she's written many wonderful books, but I had just read her verse novel Audacity, which is a young adult historical novel. And she was talking through her process for writing her verse novel. And I swear I remembered in that moment that I was a poet. And the funny thing is I had gotten so frustrated and fatigued with working with the prose version that at one point I set it aside for several months, and I put together a whole collection of my poems, which were never ever intended for children, and found a publisher and actually published a small collection of poetry just to take a break, just to get some distance. So it wasn't like I wasn't still writing poetry and thinking about poetry, but it had just never occurred to me. So after sitting in Melanie's workshop and having that epiphany, I knew immediately I need to rewrite this entire thing. And not only did I rewrite it in verse, but I changed it from past tense and third person voice into present tense and first person voice. So that the verse, I was so much more fluent as a poet than I was writing narrative prose, that the language opened up for me, but also putting it in first person present meant that we were inside her body instead of outside looking at her. And that opened up a whole lot as well. So yeah, it took me a long time to figure it out. It was painful.
Well, I've said the quote on the podcast before, and I can never remember who says it, but somebody out there says that hard writing makes for easy reading. And that's
Oh
exactly
gosh.
what this is.
I've never heard that before, but thank you for saying that. That is inspiring.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
So while I don't want to, have the writing process be difficult, it certainly is a gift to have the book in this format because of exactly what you said. We are there. We are there. We are in Maddie's head. We are feeling the fear. We're feeling the accomplishment. We're feeling all of it. And there are key segments in that book where my heart was just stopped and thought, what would I do? And then what would the 12-year-old version of me
Right.
do?
Right.
Which which
Exactly.
which every time I was learning more about Maddie, I was like, "You go, girl. You have got you got a strong head on your shoulders." It was just such an emotional read because of that and because of that format. As I said, I literally just couldn't stop turning the pages. And it helps that your first two pages are a wallop of an opening. So talk about catching attention, like you said, agents were interested because it was a contemporary remake. I imagine just reading those first two pages, I knew the dishes were going to get set aside and the laundry was going to be unfolded because I had to read it.
So what's funny about the first two pages, which is essentially it's a prologue poem, right? Is that, are you talking about the very, very first
I
poem?
sure
Yeah.
am. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that did not exist in any form in the prose version. That came later in the verse version, and it wasn't even where I began in the verse version. I began with page 5 with Maddie coming into her mom's kitchen. Um, and I thought about, so for readers who, or for listeners who aren't familiar with the story, Maddie is 12 in the beginning of the book, and she's 16 at the end of the book. So she's alone for a really long time, almost 4 years, 3.5 years or so. Um, and I wanted to give readers some sort of insight into what they were getting themselves into, right? I wanted to give them a little sneak peek of the premise then that book would then hopefully fulfill the promise of, right, if you will. So I ended up going back and writing that poem, which is from the perspective of Maddie, that opening poem, which the title is This Is Not Adolescent Hyperbole, which is a lot of, that's a lot of words for a lot of sort of juicy vocabulary for a middle grade book to start off with that particular phrase. But I really wanted them to hear her as a 16-year-old reflecting on the journey that she had been through, and then take them back to the journey so that they would have some sense of trajectory of like, okay, so she survives at least 3 years because she tells us in the beginning. Um, to to set the stage for the rest of it. And it felt to me like by doing that, by giving them that poem, then I could relax and take my time unfolding all of her experiences because they already were with me in terms of where we were going for this story.
Mm-hmm. And the story, well, I don't give spoilers. And so
Right.
we won't say anything beyond you learn about, the couple of years that she is alone. The story is a story that I think, oh gosh, how do I do it without spoilers? I guess you know how there's some books where you end the book and you're just not sure or you want to know what comes next. There is a satisfaction, I will say,
Hmm.
this story, but also wanting to know more and wanting to
Right.
do that next step, which is where Away, the companion novel, fits in. And I love how they are connected. They are
Hmm.
connected books, but they are also standalone. So you
Right.
could come to Away first and then read Alone and get the Easter eggs there, or
Yep.
you could read Alone and then read Away and start to get this fuller, bigger, richer picture about the
Yes.
experience that happened to Maddie. And so I,
Yes.
I I want readers to know, like, you can enter this conversation with either one and get the whole story behind it. Now, I know that you went from prose to verse, and
Hmm.
Alone is a verse, a novel in verse. When we get to Away, we still have verse. But we have other things too. We
Yes.
have new formats. So give listeners a bit of an overview of how the formatting, but tell us about Away
Yeah.
and the kind of the companion nature of it. And then I would love to know how it shifted and kind of evolved to include some other formats as well, which is
Yeah.
wonderful.
And I love that you used the word evolve because it really did evolve. So when I wrote Alone, it never crossed my mind that it would be part of any kind of a series at all. In my mind, it was a standalone novel. The thing that made me curious to write it was this question of a kid surviving by herself or by himself. It didn't have to be a girl. Um, and what would that experience be like and how might it ultimately be resolved? That was what motivated me and what I was curious about in exploring when I wrote that book. And while Maddie's story is concluded, right? There is a satisfactory resolution for her. There are big questions left around the context for the story, right? Which is everybody in her town was evacuated, the whole town was abandoned, the power goes out, like she doesn't know what's going on. There's this imminent threat that she is aware of because she reads it on her phone. She gets a text alert on her phone, which, by the way, the text for or the words for that particular text alert are verbatim the words that were sent out in Hawaii a number of years ago when that emergency alert went out. I don't know if you remember that.
I do
It was a
remember
it
that.
was a
Yes.
false alarm, but nobody knew it at the time. It was an accident, right? That
Yeah.
so imminent threat alert. I took that exactly from that message that went out. So the language for that text was really real. So this phrase imminent threat that was used in that original text message becomes this sort of external haunting force that Maddie doesn't know what is this threat that is supposedly imminent and yet isn't coming. Like, what, why did everybody go and is she in danger? And it's this whole contextual question that allowed me to get her alone, right? So that I could create a 21st century scenario in which a kid could be left behind and have to be alone for so long.
Mhm.
So after Alone published and I started traveling and I was invited to a lot of schools around the country and met with readers and had all kinds of great conversations and visits, everywhere I went, I got the same questions.
I was
And
asking it too. I know what
yes,
the questions
right,
are.
right. Yeah. So what was the deal with the evacuation? Where did everybody go? What happened to everybody in the evacuation? And then also what was this imminent threat? Like what was the inciting incident that caused the evacuation to happen in the first place? So after hearing these questions over and over again, um, I started thinking, well, maybe there is another book
Mhm.
that is not, and I wasn't interested in a sequel to Alone because by the end of it, Maddie's 16. Now we're getting into young adult. Uh,
Right.
there could be a really interesting story there. I'm not saying that there wouldn't be at some point, but that wasn't what I was interested in. And it clearly wasn't what the kids were interested in. They really wanted to know more about this larger context. So I thought, okay, it could be really fun to write a true companion novel that's neither prequel nor sequel and that could stand alone, but could interact with and inform the first book and vice versa. So that was always my goal, was to try to make that happen. And then I started thinking about, okay, so Alone is unique, or one of the unique features of it is that it is only one character, and she's the only voice we hear, and we're limited entirely to her perspective and her experience. So what if we go the other way? What if we take a pendular swing to the other direction and we look at it from multiple points of view? And then I thought, okay, well, it'd be fun if we've got four kids who don't know each other at all in the beginning of the book. They live in different parts of Colorado. And actually, Colorado's a little incidental, right? They could live anywhere. And kids who read verse novels tend to set them where they live because there's so little description that it allows them the freedom to fill in the details with their own personal experience, which is really wonderful. So I thought, okay, let's take four kids who don't know each other at all. Let's have them all evacuate to the same relocation shelter. And there they will meet and become friends and start to suspect something isn't quite right, and begin investigating the mystery of this so-called imminent threat. And so that was the premise that I began with. So the same exact text message that Maddie gets in Alone, everyone gets in Away.
Yes.
Um, and they actually start in the same place and they progress forward at the same pace. So they are literally keeping pace with each other, in terms of the time frame and the narrative arc of each story. So then the question was, okay, is this a verse novel? Is this a novel in prose? What do I want to do here? I had heard from so many educators that they had so many reluctant or emerging readers who had read Alone and loved it and felt successful for the first time, because it looks like, I mean, it's like almost 400 pages, but it's really about 30,000 words, right? The verse novels are much more accessible for readers who are not ready for or intimidated by big chunks of prose, right? A big block of text on the page. So I thought, well, I don't want to swing the pendulum completely into prose and leave behind the potential for those readers to learn to love to read through different formats.
Yeah.
But then I was also thinking, okay, but I've got these four different kids and I'd like for each of them to be a full-fledged voice in the book. How am I going to do that? So that's where the different formats came in. And I started thinking about what they loved, who they were, what they were passionate about, their personalities, and let the forms flow out from there. And it definitely was an evolutionary process. So two of the characters are in verse, different kinds of verse, and two of the characters are not. One of the characters, her name is Harmony. She wants to be a journalist when she grows up. She corresponds in letters to her aunt, who is an active investigative journalist. And she also writes in newspaper articles in AP format because she is always practicing
Yes.
for the day that she will have her own byline and be a reporter. And she's thinking about her school newspaper. And so her pages show up as letters and newspaper articles. There's another kid, Teddy, who wants to be a filmmaker when he grows up, and he is passionate about films and knows every movie that's ever been made. And I thought, okay, well, he needs to show up on the page in screenplay. So it's like we're literally reading the movie version, the screenplay of Teddy's life, and
Mhm.
the other characters come in and show up and often have conversations in this screenplay format. And then Ashanti is actually one of the girls from Alone who was supposed to come to the sleepover. The whole reason Maddie ends up alone is because she schemes to have this sleepover that her parents don't know about. And she lies to them, and her two best friends lie to their parents. And the whole idea is they're going to tell their parents they're at somebody else's house, but they're going to be alone at her grandma's apartment, and they'll have this sleepover with no adults. And then the next morning they'll go home and nobody will be the wiser. Well, Ashanti is one of those three girls, and she gets the stomach flu and can't come, and the whole thing, it gets canceled. But Maddie ends up having the sleepover by herself because she's already lied to her parents. So I thought, okay, it'd be really fun to have Ashanti show up in this book. So her pieces begin with planning the sleepover that she's excited to go to, and then of course she gets sick, and so readers of Alone will know, like, yeah, this isn't going to happen.
Yes.
They know more than she does in the beginning of the book. Um, but I decided that she should still be in poetry because Maddie's world is in poetry. So Ashanti is written in free verse. And her verse is also filled with allusions to Greek mythology. She loves the ancient Greek myths and the gods and the goddesses. So there's a lot of similes and metaphors that she brings into her poetry, contextualizing things through that lens. And then the last character is Grandin. He's a little bit older than the others, and he lives on a cattle ranch in the mountains and wants to go into the military. He wants to serve his country and have a career doing that, and then come home and continue ranching with his family. But Grandin is much more soft-spoken than the other three. The other three kids are kind of like out in front, go-getter, really, really focused and ambitious. And he is much more soft-spoken. He does not need to prove anything to anybody. He's more introverted, he's quieter. So he's also written in poetry, but his poetry looks really different from Ashanti's. It's far fewer words on the page, very few modifiers of any kind. He is concise and spare, but when he speaks, it really makes a difference. He has a deep well of wisdom that he draws from. So that's where I ultimately ended with the different formats. And then in order to keep them informed and to keep the story moving forward, I thought, well, heck, we've already got 4 formats. Let's throw in some press conferences. Let's throw in some newspaper reports. Let's throw in some radio. Let's throw in some different forms of information that they would have access to while they're evacuated. So that's how the hybrid format really became what it is today.
And that's how the suction cup reading happened.
It's a little bit of a leap of faith though, right? Like when you start reading it, you're not, it feels kind of disjointed. And what is this? And what's happening? And you have to stick with it I believe you have to sort of stick with it, and so that you start to see the different disparate pieces start to intersect and come together.
But I also feel like that is what the characters are also feeling. They don't
Right.
know what's going on. They are
Right.
up in the air. They're suddenly leaving. Where is dad going? All of these things are going. So as a reader, I could feel that because
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure it out in the formats and the characters and the pages, and they're trying to figure it out in their actual lives. And
Yeah.
the connections that, as you said, when you stick with it, start to happen. They're just wonderful as a reader, but to see how the kids themselves start to come together, how those different personalities maybe clash at first, but then
Yeah.
meld into this just into this amazing idea that we are underestimated, right? And there's a line in
Yeah.
there somewhere,
Yeah. Yeah.
kind of adults underestimate us, but
Yeah.
these kids, they
Yeah.
believe in themselves and their own unique special gifts. They believe
Yeah.
in each other, and they change things. I
They
won't say
do.
what it is, but I will say
Yeah.
these kids are certainly change makers
Yes.
who have something amazing to uncover.
It's so interesting that you bring up that line about underestimation. That I can't remember. I think it's Teddy who says it, but the quote is something like adults routinely underestimate children,
Yeah.
something like that. And it's funny because in a couple of reviews of the book, there have been comments about, well, but these children are clearly super advanced, and real children would never be capable of what they do or what they think about or understand. And it's funny when I read those comments, because having been a classroom teacher for 30 years, I'm here to tell you, I
Yes.
knew many, many children just like these children who are capable of incredible, extraordinary accomplishments and complex critical thinking. And when I hear that feedback, or when I get that criticism, I think, oh, you haven't met very many children.
Yes. Yes. If we get out of their way, they will
Yes,
just run right past us.
exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah.
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 And that's such a wonderful thing to see in books, because as a reader, as someone experiencing the story, you can't help but feel that inside of you as well. I think that's the beauty of books, is that you get to feel in ways that you might not experience in your
Mhm.
actual life, and then that changes you. It gets you to think differently about yourself, about
Right.
people around you, about the world. And again, no spoilers. I do appreciate how at the end there is a look forward
Yes.
of
Yes.
where are they now,
Yes.
to give that same kind of satisfaction. I think there's a double satisfaction. We know what happens with the characters in the here and now, which
Yep.
helps us make sense of Alone and
Yep.
Maddie's story. And we get to know about what is going on in the future. And
Right.
I think another theme that was evident in the book and seeing that where are they now at the end, you have that theme of kids being capable of
Hmm.
amazing things, kids being
Hmm.
change makers, but there's also this theme of hanging on to hope.
Right.
And
Right.
that is just threaded all the way through and is like the little bow at the end when you see
Right.
that future.
Well, and that's the covenant that we all of us who write for children, we covenant to always end in hope, right? I think it was Catherine Patterson that coined that beautiful phrase. But I certainly feel, and I know my colleagues who I talk with about these things all the time feel we have a moral obligation to end in hope if we're writing for children. You know, yeah, that it needs to go without saying that we're going to do that. And it's interesting that you bring up the coda at the end, the where are they now? Because one of with Teddy being an aspiring filmmaker, it he is making a documentary film through the entire story. And one of the things I love about films that are either inspired by true events or real people or documentaries that are actually looking at real people. I love it at the end when the credits roll or right before the credits roll and they give you like here's a photograph of the actor who played the character and here's a photograph of the real person and they're having a conversation or all of those sort of bringing it back together or the information of what happened with the lawsuit or whatever whatever the story was, knowing how the bigger story ended is always really satisfying for me as a film viewer. So I really wanted to bring that in, sort of as an homage to the kind of documentary that we know Teddy would want to be making.
Mm-hmm. And for me as an adult still, I think I was like this as a kid, always looking forward to. But when I see that and when I saw that at the end, I can't help but ask myself, if I were a child reading this, I'm still doing
Yeah,
it as an adult, but
yeah,
what would mine say? What do I want
yeah.
mine to say?
Yes,
Kids
yes,
go through this
exactly.
really hard thing and they
Yes,
hang on to those dreams and those hopes, even though life is very hard and different in
yes.
this space. And look what they do. Look how they
Yeah.
take that. Look where they make it. And it's yeah, it's inspiring to then
Oh,
turn
that's
around on
beautiful.
ourselves.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but I love that. I hope that that's exactly what readers experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could talk about this book and the prose and the choices that you have made for the whole day. I loved it. But I would love to ask, I won't ask if there's another one coming, although, you didn't know that Away was coming at first, so who knows? But
You actually asked me, I think you should ask me that question. Ask me
oh,
if there's
okay,
another
I'm
one
going to
coming.
ask you that. Is there another one coming? Or at least
So I am actually working on a possible book 3 right now.
wow.
And it's so funny because there is a fifth kid in a way who we never meet on the page, but he becomes important to the journey of the
Mhm.
kids in the camp.
Yes.
And his name is Mustang. And when Mustang showed up in Away, as I was drafting Away, um, he started sort of hanging out on my shoulder, and I started like, oh, are you want your own story? You want your own little book? That's interesting. So I started thinking about him, and thinking about the possibilities of a story for him because he has a completely different experience of the evacuation, completely different from the kids in the camp, and completely different from Maddie back at home. And so he was kind of hanging out in my imagination for a long time. And then I was at a school visit a few months before Away released. Away came out mid-February, and I was giving the kids sneak peeks. They had read Alone, and I was giving them sneak peeks of Away, and it was forthcoming. And this little boy raised his hand and said, "Okay, but wait. So there are 3 girls that want to come to the sleepover. So Maddie is in Alone, and now Ashanti is in Away. What happened to Emma?" And
Yes.
Emma's the third girl who's supposed to come to the sleepover but can't come. And when he said that, I thought, okay. So there's another story out there for Mustang and Emma that might be really fun to explore. So I am in very early stages, but I am working to bring something together that would Again, I think it's going to be a companion novel. I think it's going to happen simultaneously, that it could be read in either order. Um, but yeah, I'm having a good time playing with that.
That makes me so happy, Megan.
Oh my gosh. Well, and you know what else is really fun is that when I tell kids that, they all start thinking, brainstorming titles, because they're all thinking
Yeah.
about words that start with A. And I actually did, I have it here somewhere. I don't know where I put it. Oh, it's right here. I did a book signing the other day, and two little boys came through the line, and they had written
Oh,
possible A words on a napkin they got at the cafe and brought to give to me. So I'm starting to collect A words that could be titles for the third book, from readers who are very inspired and much more clever than I am. So that's been fun too.
I will send you an email.
Okay, good. Please do. I'll take all the help I can get.
Oh, this was so wonderful. Thank you so much for
Well,
coming
it's
on
my
to talk
pleasure.
about these amazing, amazing novels. Where can readers, where can listeners find you online so that they can keep up with you, keep track of this potential
Yes.
third book?
Yes. So my website is very straightforward, meganefreeman.com. And I'm on many of the socials, and there are links to all the social media platforms that I have a presence on the website. I also have a newsletter, and you can sign up for the newsletter on my website. And I encourage folks to do that because that's usually the most reliable way to know what's going on. But I also post actively on Instagram, and Facebook, and occasionally on Twitter and Blue Sky. So yeah, I would love to hear from readers. It's always a great pleasure to open my inbox and see messages from folks.
Yeah. Well, listeners, I think you have to get it for yourself to see if you are suction cupped to the page too, and help me spread that new way of reading for these first novels. Thank you again, Megan. This is a wonderful conversation. I'm so honored to be able to help you kind of launch these
Oh
books
my
out there to
gosh.
readers.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me and for taking the time to read. And your enthusiasm is so contagious. I appreciate it so much. And I also just want to thank you so much for all you do for readers and authors, because we sit and we write our books, but we can't connect to readers the way you do and the way educators and booksellers do. And we're very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you for
Yep.
that. I appreciate that. And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all of the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes and at alitlife.com. You'll also find KidLit Love on Substack. That's where you'll find posts for each episode, monthly KidLit roundups, and an invitation to join my summer book club and go deeper into the world of children's literature. And if you loved this podcast and want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of KidLit Love. Thanks for listening.